Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Danny Devlin. I'm the Managing Director for Strategic Cultural Partnerships here at William & Mary, and it's my pleasure to open tonight's program. Tonight's program is part of both We the Teachers from William & Mary and the National Council for History Education, and conversations on the Declaration presented in partnership with our friends at Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest. 250 years ago, the idea of American independence stopped being a whisper and became a declaration. But here's the thing we forget. On the day it was signed, no one knew what it would become. It wasn't yet a monument, it wasn't yet under glass, it was ink, still drying, and a question mark. Tonight belongs to that moment. Dr. Emily Sneff is a historian of the founding era and the author of a new book from the Oxford University Press, When the Declaration of Independence Was News. She's a consulting curator for several of the major exhibitions marking the 250th anniversary, and she spent much of this year on the road with the book. So we're very, very glad indeed that she's found her way back to Williamsburg and back to William & Mary, where she earned her MA and PhD in history. Her book returns us to the summer of 1776, when the Declaration was not yet a founding document, but a story in motion, carried by printers and post riders, ship captains and clerks, preachers and translators. Ordinary people, most of them unnamed by history, who took an uncertain document and moved it forward, hand to hand, until an idea became a nation. That work continues in every classroom where a teacher reads that text and asks students what it means and what it asks of them still. The educators here tonight, gathered from every state in the country, are the next riders in that long relay. The Declaration was news in 1776, and in your hands, it's news again every September. After the talk, we'll have about 20 or 30 minutes for Q&A, so hold on to your questions. As we mark the passing of one semi-quincentennial and look forward to the next 250 years, it seems only right to begin the way the country did, with the story of how the word got out. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Emily Sneff.
Thank you, Danny, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to Williamsburg. I'm so pleased to be with you all, and this is actually a pretty funny event for me because I earned my PhD at William & Mary, but my advisor had actually moved on from William & Mary by the time I defended my dissertation, which was also called When the Declaration of Independence Was News. And my committee was up for a bit of a road trip, so I actually defended my dissertation in Rhode Island. And I have never talked about when the Declaration of Independence was news here at the institution that gave me my PhD for that dissertation. So I'm pleased to be with you all and to be back on campus. I still hate the humidity here, but I like everything else about Williamsburg. And Danny's introduction really set up what we're going to talk about this evening pretty perfectly, because I like to begin by asking a question. What is the Declaration of Independence? And more specifically, what is the Declaration of Independence? What's the image that pops into your minds? Or when you're an educator, what's the image that you can anticipate will pop into the minds of your students? And for many people, it is the signed parchment copy of the Declaration of Independence, which you're looking at here. And I know it looks almost like I have a blank piece of parchment up on the screen. The image that's actually more familiar to you is probably what you see on the left. This is an engraving which was created in the 1820s at the behest of John Quincy Adams, who was then Secretary of State, and the parchment lived in the State Department's papers. And this image of the handwritten and signed copy of the Declaration, it's what we see on movie posters, on book covers, including my own. It's the Declaration font that has been used quite a bit this year. It's a very iconic image, but it is not the signed parchment, right? It's replicating what that document initially looked like. And the parchment itself is a misleading document. In the book, I call it timeless in the worst sense of the word. So let me just explain what I mean before you go grab your pitchforks and run me out of town. The Declaration of Independence was not signed on the 4th of July. That's a very simple fact. It's a fun fact to share with students, because especially during this 250th, we have heard many, many times that the 4th of July is the anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. In fact, on July 4th, the Congress was focused on publishing the news of independence. They turned their attention to signing later in July. So on July 19th, they ordered the creation of the handwritten parchment copy to be signed by the delegates, and that parchment was ready on August 2nd. So if you imagine back to 250 years ago, Timothy Matlack was probably working on the parchment. Not that it would have taken him a full 2 weeks to write it out by hand, but he was a really busy guy, so he was probably working on it one random afternoon in that sort of late July, early August period of time. And you can see here that not all of the delegates signed on August 2nd. I've crossed out the names of the individuals who were not in Philadelphia on that date. So unlike the Constitution, which was signed on a single day, the Declaration was signed over time. And for the most part, the delegates who signed later in the fall added their names at the bottom of their respective state delegations. You can see at the bottom right, we have Matthew Thornton, who was from New Hampshire, and his name should be up with Josiah Bartlett and William Whipple. But no one knew on August 2nd that Matthew Thornton would be joining the Continental Congress in November of 1776. So Sam Adams just signed his name, and on they went with the rest of the New England delegations, and Thornton signed where he could when he arrived. Now, the exception to names being added at the bottom of delegations is Virginia, which is in that column below John Hancock's signature. And you can see there, the first Virginian to sign the Declaration of Independence was Thomas Jefferson. He left space above his name for two other Virginians, George Wythe and Richard Henry Lee, to sign the Declaration when they returned to Philadelphia. This is the same Jefferson who put author of the Declaration of Independence on his tombstone. And yet, when it came to signing the document, he was deferential. He was thinking about appearances of what the parchment would look like to future generations. And so he left space. He left so much space that Carter Braxton is really squished in at the bottom of the parchment. So if you were just to look at the handwritten and signed parchment, let alone the engraving of it that was created decades later, you would be missing out on all of this nuance of the process of declaring independence. And as I said, the parchment is not necessarily the Declaration, it's a copy of the Declaration of Independence, and one that had a pretty privileged audience of just the members of the Continental Congress in 1776. Now, another story that circulates with the parchment, and this is honestly more like a boomers and Gen Z sort of memory than more recent generations, but there's a story that John Hancock, the president of the Continental Congress, signed his name big enough for the king to read without his spectacles. And this is a story that provokes an image of a sort of Schoolhouse Rock reaction that the king must have had to independence. If you start to think about that story, which many people just take for granted, it falls apart immediately. Because in the first place, the Continental Congress did not send the parchment Declaration of Independence to King George. They had sent their previous petitions to him because they were asking for his help. But by this time, they had turned their backs on the king, and instead the Declaration is all about the king. It was not for him. So they didn't send him any copy of the Declaration, let alone the handwritten and signed parchment copy that was meant to be the record of the delegates pledging their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. So it's these kinds of myths that, as I've been on the road talking about the Declaration of Independence, I try to bust right up front so that we can get to all of the other copies of the Declaration and emphasize the fact that the parchment is just one very small part of the story. And there's a lot of stories that have been built up around it, but there are many other copies of the Declaration of Independence, and many other people and places involved in that process of declaring independence. So the premise of the book, and I do have my Sharpie here for anyone who has the book with them and would like a signature afterwards, but the premise of the book is that publishing the news of independence to the world was messy work. And we've already seen a bit of messiness in the fact that the parchment does not survive in pristine condition. And there's other copies of the Declaration where the ink has faded over time or it has eaten through the paper. There's copies of the Declaration with smudgy fingerprints on them, or ink that offset when still wet pieces of paper were stacked together. There's annotated copies of the Declaration, which are my favorite because they give us the information we need to figure out who made them, who owned them, how they traveled. So there's that material messiness of independence. But there's also a messiness in terms of the efficiency of communication, or rather lack thereof in many cases. You see a sort of haphazard distribution of the Declaration in 1776. And one sort of key aspect of the time when the Declaration of Independence was news is that information moved at a very different pace than it does today. So only people in Philadelphia would have known about the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. It would have taken days, if not weeks, for the word to spread to other places. So when we talk to young people in particular who are used to getting news instantaneously from the other side of the planet, you have to really kind of reset expectations of how people would have experienced this moment of 1776 and when they would have experienced it. So the first printings of the Declaration of Independence were key to spreading the news. These broadsides, which are basically poster-sized sheets with the text printed on one side, these were created by John Dunlap on the night of July 4th through the day of July 5th. His printing office was a few blocks from Independence Hall. He was a Northern Irish immigrant printer, and I had a realization as I've been talking about Dunlap this year. He's actually younger than I am. When he printed the Declaration, it's like when you realize everyone on your favorite sports team is younger than you. But Dunlap was a trusted printer. He had been printing resolutions for the Continental Congress. And we don't know exactly how much they paid him for his order of broadsides, how many he printed. We know that he must have printed probably a few hundred to fulfill the needs of the Continental Congress. Because when they passed the Declaration of Independence, they decided that it needed to be sent out to each of the states and also to George Washington at the head of the Continental Army. We'll come back to him in a moment. So these broadsides would have been flying off of Dunlap's press. And actually the first announcement of the Declaration of Independence was on July 5th in a German newspaper in Philadelphia, which said that the Continental Congress had approved the Declaration of Independence and that it was in the press in English. So that happened on July 5th in a German language newspaper. And then the next day, the Declaration was printed itself in newspapers, which I'll come back to in a moment. So Dunlap's broadsides were kind of the first effort to get the word of the Declaration out. And they're also, it's probably the second most iconic image of the Declaration. So if you're looking for a sort of visual replacement for the handwritten and signed parchment that speaks to 1776, Dunlap's broadsides are the way to go. Now, these broadsides were used for the first public readings of the Declaration of Independence, which took place in the greater Philadelphia area on Monday, July 8th. And that was election day in Pennsylvania. They were electing representatives for a constitutional convention to create a new government for the Commonwealth. And so the Committee of Safety meeting in Philadelphia decided that since everyone would be coming out to polling places for the election, it made sense to schedule readings of the Declaration of Independence on that day at noon. So then people could hear the Declaration read aloud and take the news back to their communities. The reading that happened outside of Independence Hall for Philadelphia County has been the most storied. It's recreated every year at Independence Hall, and the reader at that event was John Nixon. It should have been the sheriff of Philadelphia County. In many places, it was the sheriffs who were asked to read the Declaration aloud. But for whatever reason, the sheriff of Philadelphia County gave the responsibility to John Nixon, who was the colonel of a battalion of Pennsylvania Associators, or militiamen. According to John Adams, John Nixon had a really annoying voice. And it's possible that's the guy you want to read the Declaration in a time before amplification. I actually got the unique experience this year to hear what it would have been like in 1776, because I went to the recreation of the reading of the Declaration on July 8th, and the John Nixon was wearing a lavalier mic, which didn't work for the first line of the Declaration. So we all got a sense of how hard it is for voices to naturally travel over a crowd. We really needed it to be mic'd, and it was a much smaller crowd than what would have been there in 1776. The crowd on that day would have numbered in the hundreds, if not thousands. There's differing reports of the size. One of the people who was in the crowd to hear the Declaration read aloud was James Forten. And if you take a look at his dates here, you'll notice that he was 9 years old when he heard the Declaration read aloud in 1776. Forten went on to become an incredibly successful entrepreneur, one of the richest free black men in Philadelphia, and a leading advocate for abolition. And he remembered back to this moment of hearing the Declaration when he was a child. And we can see the trajectory that it had for him, right? The influence on his life. John Quincy Adams was the same age in 1776. Look where he ended up. There were children in the crowds hearing the Declaration of Independence for the first time with family members. There were free black people. There were indentured servants and enslaved people within earshot of these readings of the Declaration. These crowds were much more diverse than we have the records to actually show us. And so we have to extrapolate their experiences from the records that do survive. Now, there's another Dunlap broadside that I wanted to talk about. This one is on view right now in the Museum of the American Revolution's special exhibit, The Declaration's Journey, which I had the privilege to curate with a team of terrific scholars. And you see here a portrait of a Jewish merchant named Jonas Phillips. And alongside his portrait, there are 3 documents. One of those first printings of the Declaration of Independence, a letter, which was enclosing it when Jonas Phillips tried to send this copy of the Declaration to a relative in Amsterdam, and then also 10 pounds that he was trying to send to his mother. Good Jewish boy. I wish we had the portrait of Jonas's wife, Rebecca, alongside him, if only because they had 21 children. And every time I mention that, people have that same reaction. But in reality, Rebecca was incredibly influential on Jonas Phillips. He came to this country, to what became the United States, as an indentured servant. And after working off his indenture, he moved to New York, where he married Rebecca. And she was part of a prominent Sephardic Jewish family in New York. And so he really used her connections to establish himself as a merchant. And then they moved to Philadelphia, and their shop was just a few doors down from John Dunlap's printing office. So I imagine that this copy of the Declaration was maybe hanging up in Jonas Phillips's shop, or it was just laying around. And then at the end of July 1776, he folded it up and enclosed it in a letter and tried to send it to Amsterdam. And he took the tactic of sending his correspondence through Dutch communications channels, because at this time, it was risky business to send mail directly across the Atlantic to Europe. There's British ships everywhere. And so to avoid British interception, Jonas Phillips sent his letter and the Declaration of Independence to the Dutch island of St. Eustatius, to a mercantile contact there. and then he forwarded it on to Amsterdam. We know it got to St. Eustatius, but sometime after it left, it was intercepted by the British, despite Jonas Phillips's best efforts. Now here's the letter that was enclosing the Declaration of Independence, and I know it's kind of hard to see on the screen, so let me zoom in. Is that better? So Jonas Phillips wrote this letter in Yiddish. He wrote this in a language that he knew and that his correspondent knew, but anyone who might get their hands on the letter in between Philadelphia and Amsterdam probably wouldn't know. And I have to imagine, if I put myself in the shoes of a British officer on a ship in the Atlantic, and I get this envelope that has a letter dated Philadelphia, July 1776, and it's written in what kind of looks like code, and it's enclosing the Declaration of Independence, I might have thought I hit the jackpot. So it's no surprise that this letter was intercepted, and all of these documents have lived in the British National Archives, in the intercepted papers, since 1776. And we were able to bring them back to Philadelphia 250 years later. I like to call it a very long return to sender. This is Jonas Phillips's Dunlap broadside, and you can see it's stamped Her Majesty's State Paper Office and cataloged in the National Archives. The British National Archives have one of the best collections of the Declaration of Independence. It keeps getting better. They just announced before July 4th that they had uncovered another broadside of the Declaration that had also been intercepted in 1776. So it just shows you how many copies of the Declaration did not reach their intended destinations and instead ended up in British hands. So I mentioned that the Declaration was printed in newspapers after John Dunlap's initial printing. This is the first newspaper printing of the Declaration, which was created on Saturday, July 6th, 1776. This is Benjamin Towns' Pennsylvania Evening Post, which was a tri-weekly evening newspaper at a time when most newspapers in the colonies turned United States were printed once a week and in the mornings. So Town was really trying to get the latest information in front of his readers, and he really succeeded the first week of July 1776. He got the Declaration out before anyone else. Even John Dunlap didn't print the Declaration ahead of his normal publication schedule for his newspaper, which was on Mondays. So his newspaper printing of the Declaration is dated Monday, July 8th. The Declaration was also translated within days of July 4th into German. I suggested the importance of German newspapers with that first announcement of the Declaration being in the press. And I love these German printings of the Declaration, both this broadside, which was created by Melchior Steiner and Charles Sist, and the German newspaper printing in the Staatsbote in Philadelphia. This broadside, only 2 copies are known to survive. I'm guessing there are more out there and they just haven't been identified because they don't say a declaration in English at the top. But this particular copy is at the Museum of the American Revolution. The only other known copy is in Berlin. So Philadelphia is a much shorter trip if you want to check it out in person. And then the Staatsbote printing we have on view in one of the other museum exhibits I worked on at Historic Trap, where our exhibit is about Pennsylvania Germans' experience of the American Revolution. So I made sure to get German in both of the exhibits that I was working on. And it's really personal for me because I'm descended from Pennsylvania Germans who were living in the Philadelphia area in 1776. And I wonder how they received the news of independence. Was it in English, or was it in the language in which they operated their day-to-day lives? And although you may think like, well, you can only really access these copies of the Declaration if you know German, I think they're actually really useful tools for students who come from immigrant communities, who may speak a different language at home, to be able to see that the Declaration was a multilingual document from the very beginning is actually really empowering for young people who are coming from immigrant communities. So I love these German printings, and I'm glad that I was able to get them on view to the best of my abilities this year. They're also really good translations of the Declaration. Melchior Steiner and Charles Sist had also translated Thomas Paine's Common Sense. They were used to the revolutionary vocabulary that was coming out of Philadelphia, and so they understood those key principles like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all men are created equal. They knew how to translate that. If we compare these translations created in Philadelphia with German translations created in Europe, where the Gazette printers there were translating word for word, because the Declaration was just a news item like any other, the Declaration really loses its power when you do that. It takes someone who's steeped in that experience of 1776 and independence to really translate it in a way that German people would have had the same experience of the Declaration as their Anglo-American neighbors. Now, let's move out of Philadelphia and get a sense of the different stories that come up as we move from place to place through time. And the most important recipient of the Declaration of Independence was George Washington, in my opinion. Washington was not in Philadelphia. He was in New York with the Continental Army, preparing for a British attack, which seemed like it might come any day. And so he received the Declaration of Independence and instructions from the Continental Congress to publish it to the Continental Army in whatever way he thought was best. And he decided to order all of the soldiers in Manhattan to assemble at 6 o'clock in the evening on July 9th to hear the Declaration read aloud. You'll often see this event described as Washington reading the Declaration to the troops. Technologically, that wouldn't have really worked for one guy to read the Declaration to tens of thousands of soldiers. What actually happened is that someone stepped to the front of every brigade and read the Declaration, probably from one of John Dunlap's broadsides. And then each brigade responded. They cheered. In one case, in the artillery regiment, the chaplain offered a prayer for the future of the United States. There was these different sort of experiences throughout this sort of mass public reading event. And Washington reported back to John Hancock that the Declaration seemed to have the most hearty assent of the soldiers, the expressions and behavior both of officers and men testifying their warmest approbation of it. Was a really positive experience, because now the Continental Army had clarity about what they were fighting for. Previously, they had been fighting for reconciliation with Great Britain on better terms, with more rights. Now it was clear that they were the fighting force of the independent United States, and they had to actually win the war to secure the independence that the Continental Congress had just declared. Unfortunately for Washington, something else happened on July 9th in the evening. The larger-than-life gilded statue of King George III was toppled over and beheaded. This is a statue that sat on the Bowling Green in what's now the financial district in Manhattan. It was not that old. It had only been put up a few years before 1776. And it was broken up into pieces. You can see the horse's tail survives intact, along with a few other pieces. But the rest of the statue was carted off to Connecticut to be melted down and turned into bullets to be fired back at the British forces. It's an incredibly, sort of meaningful moment. The chapter that I have about this in the book is called Melted Majesty, which is from one account of the statue's destruction. You can see another account here in one of New York's newspapers calling it the just desert of an ungrateful tyrant. And it remains a mystery to this day who tore down the statue. Was it soldiers? Was it civilians? We don't know. And because of that confusion, Washington felt like he had to address the destruction of the statue. So in his general orders for the next day, he said, though the general doubts not the persons who pulled down and mutilated the statue were actuated by zeal in the public cause. He doesn't disagree with the statue coming down. He was probably sick of looking at King George. But it had so much the appearance of riot and want of order that he disapproved of the manner in which the statue came down. He was really worried that all eyes were on New York, And if the Continental Army didn't put on their best face, if they gave the appearance of being a mob, then perceptions about whether independence could succeed or not would not be faring so well. So this moment for Washington, I would love to be a fly on the wall when he heard about the destruction of the statue, to see his reaction to it. And it becomes a sort of defining moment of when the news of independence spread. There were many other moments, though, when the symbols of the king were torn down and burned in bonfires in the streets. Down in Savannah, Georgia, they carted an effigy of the king through the streets and then buried him in a funeral. There's all this sort of iconoclasm that happened around the announcement of independence. So another story that is really fascinating and is starting to get more attention, but I think is still sort of unknown to many people, has to do with the Wabanaki chiefs who came down to Massachusetts in July 1776, hoping to meet with George Washington, not realizing that he had moved from Boston down to New York. And so the Massachusetts government scrambled to organize a treaty meeting with these Wolostoqiyik and Mi'kmaq chiefs who seemed anxious to join the fight for independence. In the middle of this treaty meeting, the Declaration of Independence arrived, and it was translated into French for the chiefs who knew that language and could further translate. And one of the Wolostoqiyik chiefs, Ambrose Bierce, responded, "We like it well." Now, whether those are the actual words he said or not, we're not sure. That's what the minutes say. But those 4 words, "we like it well," mark the first acknowledgement of the independent United States. You can see Ambrose Bierce's pictogram at the top left here. He's not necessarily a known character in the founding of the United States, and yet he's the one who gives voice to the legitimacy of independence, the sovereignty of the United States. Those signatures are at the bottom of what's called the Treaty of Watertown. That's where this treaty meeting took place. The treaty was signed shortly after the Declaration of Independence arrived. And in fact, the last paragraph of the Declaration was incorporated into the first paragraph of the treaty. I think this is an incredibly important moment because the way that Native people are described in the Declaration is one of the biggest challenges that we have with engaging with the text today. They are described as merciless Indian savages engaging in violence on the frontiers of colonial settlements. That represents only a small fraction of Native lived experience in 1776. There were some nations who were engaging in violence to sort of prevent the colonists from westward expansion, but there were many, many more nations who wanted to remain neutral in the conflict, and they were thinking about what was best for their own people. And then you also have examples like these Wabanaki chiefs of people who were enthusiastic about independence. 3 of the Mi'kmaq chiefs who were present at this treaty meeting jumped out of their chairs and offered to leave for New York immediately to fight alongside George Washington. So it's an incredible counterbalance to the way that Native people were described in the Declaration. We get a very sort of slight view of how Native nations were part of the story of the founding if we look at the text of the Declaration. But if we look at the way that the text was received in other places, the story becomes much more dynamic. Now, staying in Massachusetts, this is one of my favorite printings of the Declaration of Independence. And I noted at the beginning that my advisor moved on from William and Mary while I was working on my dissertation. She moved to the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University, which happens to have a fantastic collection of copies of the Declaration. So I could not have lucked out more. And this particular copy of the Declaration, I first saw when I went up to do research at the library shortly after she started there. And it was minimally cataloged. It just said who the printer was. I had seen other broadsides done by these printers. And then the archivist brought it out, and I realized this is an incredible copy of the Declaration. First of all, it's annotated. So the list of grievances is numbered, and that shows close reading of the text, right? Someone sitting there and numbering each grievance. Towards the end of the list, they lost track, something that's happened to all of us. It says 25, then 27, corrected to 26. But still, this shows someone intently reading all of the complaints about King George III. And then at the bottom of the broadside, it's signed. And this is really a unique example. I have not come across any other copy of the Declaration that the owner decided to sign just below John Hancock's printed signature. So you're probably wondering, who is Daniel Gould? And that's what I was wondering when I first laid eyes on this broadside. Thankfully, he left us a note. If we flip the Declaration over, there's no treasure map, but there is a note that tells us about his life. And so when I first saw this, I was just astonished at it, because he wrote, "I bought this when the Declaration of Independence was first celebrated in Boston in the year 1776, when I was a soldier in the American Army." This is an incredible, incredible example of someone writing down the exact experience of receiving the news of independence. I couldn't have asked for anything more. I could have asked for a few more details. I still had to do some digging to figure out which Daniel Gould this was. But I finally was able to track him down. And because he said he was a soldier in the American Army and he was in Boston, that was my first sort of clue to triangulate which Daniel Gould this was. It turns out that this Daniel Gould was in Boston at a time when most of the Continental Army had moved on to New York or Canada, because he was a lifeguard, a personal protector to Major General Artemus Ward, who was left in charge of the remaining regiments in Boston. So that's why he was there at this particular moment. And so I went very quickly from this being a minimally cataloged broadside to this being one of my favorite copies of the Declaration. And in fact, it is now the featured object in the library's exhibit for the 250th. And they had no idea that it was in their collections. So there's still stories that we're learning about in the archives. Now, staying in Boston, I have to talk about everyone's favorite founding lady, Abigail Adams. And of course, Abigail is most known for her March 1776 letter, where she encourages her husband, "Remember the ladies." But if you look just above that part of her letter, she says, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency." And we often skip over that part. Remember the ladies is about remembering women when new governments are created, thinking about the rights of women, especially property rights. But she also longed to hear the Declaration of Independence. And in fact, Abigail ended up having multiple moments of receiving the news of independence. In the book, I talk about this letter that she started writing on July 13th and finished writing on July 14th. So on July 13th, she picked up her pen to tell her husband that she had traveled to Boston to have herself and their children inoculated for smallpox. There was a very short window of time where smallpox was legal in Boston, and she took advantage of it. She had not written to her husband in a couple of weeks, which was very suspicious in their correspondence. They're writing back and forth all the time. But she didn't want him to worry, because she knew that he would want to be with her and their children as they went through inoculation. And she also knew that he was working on the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the model treaty for a plan for alliance with France. The guy was busy. She didn't want him to feel distracted or beholden to his family at this moment. So she waits until the day after they're all inoculated to write and tell him that they have been. And she writes this letter updating him on the family, and then she sets down her pen, and the mail arrives from Philadelphia, and she receives the Declaration of Independence. Now, she probably had received a draft from John earlier. There's a draft in his handwriting that we think he must have shared with her, because she knew what was in the draft versus the final version of the text. She was one of very few people to know that in 1776. But on Sunday, July 14th, she picked her pen back up and finished writing her letter by telling John that the previous day's mail had brought the news of independence. And she writes not only about how happy she is, she was longing for a declaration, now she's finally got it, but she's so proud to be connected to someone at the center of the story, right? She feels like her sacrifice of her family being, apart from her husband is worth it because he made sure that the Declaration of Independence happened. So this is her first moment of receiving the final Declaration of Independence, probably one of the first printed copies, either the newspaper or John Dunlap's broadside. And then she turned out on July 18th for the first public reading of the Declaration at the Old State House in Boston. And then a few weeks later, she heard the Declaration read aloud in her family's Boston church. That was part of the official dissemination strategy in Massachusetts, that the Declaration was sent to every parish, and ministers were required to read it aloud and then deposit the Declaration with the town clerk. So in August, she heard the Declaration read aloud, and her experience of it was probably pretty positive. She was sitting among other people who agreed with independence underneath a bell that John Hancock had purchased for the church, right? This was probably a pretty patriotic event. But when I was up at the Massachusetts Historical Society a couple weeks ago, in their current exhibit, they have a letter on view that tells a different story. Elizabeth Murray, who was about 20 years old in 1776, this is a later portrait of her, she wrote about the experience of hearing the Declaration read aloud at her church. And she said that the minister walked down the middle aisle to read the Declaration, and happily it was not till the service was over, so that those that oppose it came out of church, of which number I was one. So she's basically saying, thank goodness he waited so we could leave. And that just shows that there were people in 1776 who didn't agree with the Declaration of Independence. Those voices tend to get drowned out by all the celebration, all the huzzas. Another example, also from Massachusetts, which I love, especially using with young people, comes from Kezia Coffin, who was 17 years old. She lived on the island of Nantucket in a whaling community there. And someone brought the Declaration over from Cape Cod, and when she read it, she wrote in her diary that it was horrible, not the response that you tend to expect in 1776. But she went on. She said that she wished that the Continental Congress and all of their adherents had been strung 50 feet in the air before they had been allowed to bring about their wicked and ruinous plans. And then at the end of her diary entry, she said, "The Lord reward them according to their words." Very ominous for a teenage girl's diary. I love the example of Kezia because even though she was in a fairly remote island community, she understood the political situation around her. And also, she stayed in the independent United States, even though she disagreed with independence. She got married, she stayed on Nantucket, her diary survived in the Nantucket Historical Society. So we think about there being this loyalist diaspora, that everyone who disagreed with independence got out of town. That's not quite accurate to 1776. Some people remained part of their communities, even though they thought independence wasn't the right path forward. Now, in that same vein, we have to look at Robert Christie, who was the sheriff of Baltimore County. And Robert Christie, it seems like he was aligned with the royal governor of Maryland, maybe loyalist leaning, but he was tasked with reading the Declaration of Independence aloud in Baltimore, and initially he agreed. Then on the day of the reading, he was out of town, and people noticed. He made himself scarce, and I think he probably was on the fence about independence, or maybe he was a staunch loyalist, but he didn't want to be the one to deliver the news. He didn't want to be part of the process of declaring independence. Honestly, I don't blame him, because here's what happened in Baltimore after the Declaration was read aloud that day. At night, the town was illuminated, and an effigy of our late king was carted through the town and committed to the flames amidst the acclamations of many hundreds. If you had any sort of positive feelings about the king, you probably didn't want to be involved in this scene. So Christie was able to stay on in his position as sheriff of Baltimore County, but you can imagine that the community was kind of suspicious of him. And then at the end of the year, he received this note in the middle of the night. Your conduct has been such in this state during our struggle for liberty that we are at this present moment determined that unless you leave the town instantly and the state within 6 days, your life shall be sacrificed by an injured people. And it was signed Legion. So needless to say, Christie got out of town. He went into hiding and then eventually evacuated. And the reason we have this account is because he petitioned the Loyalist Claims Commission for compensation for having to leave Baltimore and Maryland. And so you can see the sticky situation of people who were supposed to be part of the process of declaring independence, didn't know how they felt about it, or maybe wanted to stay loyal to the king, and ultimately got driven out of town. Now, I wanted to highlight Williamsburg, of course, as we're here, and if you didn't know, all of the newspapers in Williamsburg are the Virginia Gazette, which is very confusing when you're teaching here, and you have to distinguish between the different Virginia Gazettes. So I wanted to begin with Alexander Purdy's Virginia Gazette. And Purdy was unique in 1776 in the United States because he only printed an excerpt of the Declaration. He printed the last few paragraphs in his newspaper on July 19th. This was not because he disagreed with independence or he was trying to sort of keep the news under wraps. This was because he was out of room. He had filled up his newspaper for the week by the time the Declaration arrived, and he prioritized another story, which filled up most of the columns you see here. It was the story of Lord Dunmore at Gwynn's Island. Lord Dunmore was the royal governor of Virginia. He had issued this proclamation in 1775, promising freedom to enslaved people who joined the British side of the conflict. And so all these people had flocked to him, and they were moving on ships kind of around the Chesapeake Bay and had docked at Gwynn's Island for a while. There was a skirmish with Continental forces, and Dunmore evacuated Gwynn's Island. And so the account that Purdy privileged over the Declaration of Independence was about what Dunmore left behind on Gwynn's Island. And it's a horrific account of bodies left dead and dying, of people who had sought freedom with him and instead contracted smallpox and other diseases and were left behind, and in some cases left in temporary shelters that were set on fire as the British were leaving the island, and they burned to death. The descriptions in this account are just horrific. This was a cautionary tale in the eyes of Williamsburg's printers. They wanted to get the news out because it gave the sense that enslaved people were better off on their enslavers' plantations than they were seeking freedom with the British. And so that's why Purdy made this business decision to print only an excerpt of the Declaration and save the rest for the next week's issue. You can see some of the description here where it talks about near 500 souls left behind on the island, and this is someone's own account from going over to the island, and they say that they counted 130 graves, or rather holes loosely covered over with earth. This just shows how the Declaration was in conversation with slavery, and the questions of whose equality, whose freedom, were right there in 1776. So Alexander Purdy printed the Declaration in full in his next issue on July 26th. But I mentioned that there were multiple Virginia Gazettes, and his competitors, Dixon and Hunter, printed their newspaper the day after Purdy every week. And so they printed the Declaration in full on July 20th. Purdy must have known the risk that he was taking by not printing the declaration in full, and that's why I think it was a business decision to prioritize this account from Gwynn's Island. And it's an important reminder that printers were curators of information. Printers had control over different news stories, how they were presented to the public, and how much importance was placed on different news events.